Mhm. Okay, so good morning, or well, morning for me, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. This is our cosmic conversation, our second one this year, but in a project that has been going from since 2020. Uh, and I am Fernando. I will be the host today and mediator of this conversation. I am part of the APPH, the institution that is promoting the series of conversations, the Association for Research and Practice in the Humanities here in Porto Alegre, Brazil. And we have the pleasure of having here with us this time Patricia Reed and Simon Turner, who Patricia especially I've known for a while, but we have especially this October, we have had the opportunity of making some soup together, some future soup, primordial soup, time soup, a lot of collective working around whatever we could do with words and with food there with our soup. So this is, and I'll explain later what I'm talking about. But the idea for us today is to talk about the topic of habitability, which is something that we've been working on for a little while. Our conversation today has the title of Inhabiting an Alien Planet, Adaptation and Inadaptation, because for these past few months that we have been asked by the HKV, the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, to think about the topic of habitability coming from our different disciplines, which are somewhat or pretty different, as we are going to learn in a second. We were tasked to think about this topic for them as the Anthropocene project is coming to a close in the house, and we had a very I think our reflections were very close to each other, but also there was a lot more to talk about than we had the time during the stage time that we had in Berlin and the texts that we wrote. And I felt like that wasn't enough to think about all the things that we had to think about, and especially to have a pleasurable conversation, most of all, with Patricia and Simon about this topic. So today we have the opportunity of going over this topic of habitability once more. And to me, especially thinking about this image that haunts me, I guess, this idea of this planet becoming more or less alien to us, or us becoming alien to it as it transforms and becomes more suitable for other life forms. So what I've called in other things the xenomorphing of the planet. Somewhat we've managed to make a very nice living planet, but for other beings that aren't us, or the beings that live here in this planet with us until now, which is, I mean, good job, I guess. So we're going to go over that too in our conversation. But before we get too much into it, I wanted to ask Patricia and Simon to introduce themselves to our audience, although I'm sure some of you who are watching already know them. And especially, and you can take a little while here, 5 minutes, 10 minutes if you want, to go over a little bit, how does your past work and present work connect to this question of habitability? And why do you feel you are here right now? Okay, so whoever wants to start.
I'll start. I mean, I'll jump in. Thanks so much, Fernando, for the invitation, and always lovely to chat with you, Simon. I'm always grateful to have your geological expertise, and also you're just a fun, weird mind that is very playful. So it's always exciting to see what sort of like emerges. So I'm joining you from Berlin, where I live. It's cold. That's why we're like in blankets. Um, and as Fernando said, had the pleasure of working with these two and others for an event where we were trying to think about this question of habitability in relation to the planetary through the vehicle of food and cooking. And the reason I think I'm here is because a lot of my theoretical work, I work as an artist, writer, and designer, freelancer, and a lot of my work is in a very general way, very interested in the relationship between the abstraction of models and how they influence the practices on the ground, right? So like, what is the relationship between models and how they may transform our imagination of inhabitation? Because clearly this needs to change. I'm interested in tackling that question from a cosmological perspective. Um, which and part of the work that I'm interested in doing is asking the question is like, what is planetary space? So the sort of working hypothesis is that if this planetary turn is to kind of indicate or index a fundamental historical shift from Euromodernity, we can see how within the Euromodern paradigm, it was also infamous for arriving with a new invention of space that was a very different concept of space to previous years. So the sort of the direction that I'm taking it is to say, well, if this is going to be a different historical epoch, then what is the kind of corresponding space of conceptual embedding that we need to invent, construct, understand? And of course, the question of scale factors in quite heavily into this, because the sort of loose model that I'm still really working out, and both theoretically and artistically, is to ask, like, what does it mean to imagine inhabitation in a space of high dimensions? And by that, it just means like, increased complexity, increased entanglement, some of it voluntary, some of it involuntary, some of it beneficial, some of it punitive, right? We can't just celebrate entanglement as such. So I think that's probably why I'm here, is that interest in figuring out what that those new spatial coordinates could be, that could help understand how we position, humanness within the planetary framework.
Great, Patricia. Simon.
Awesome, isn't it? I like listening to Patricia explain things. So my name's Simon Turner. I am a research scientist based at University College London in the geography department there. I'm also the secretary of the Anthropocene Working Group, which is the International Commission of Stratigraphy commission group to establish, it was set up to see whether or not we can actually define this, the Anthropocene, as a geological epoch. I've had about 20 plus years of working with sediments, so I guess I would say I'm a geologist. If I'm a geologist, I'm on the fringe, I think, of geology, as I've only really worked with soft materials. Like mud, essentially. I've worked with mud. I very rarely work with rocks. And I've always been very interested in the relationship between human activity and what effect it has on geological processes. And so that sort of led me to do, I've always been very interested in this interface between when you have like historical change or archaeological change, and then it results in geological changes, and also similarly, if you have geological changes like sea level change or increased sedimentation, what effect that also has on human activity. So I've always worked in this sort of interface between sort of earth science and I guess sort of social science, but I don't have any social science training. So there's always this, it's interesting to work at this interface with quite different skill sets, that you can be very skilled in geology, but if you're talking about history, you don't necessarily do history. And with that aspect, and as you'll see later when we start discussing these things, I will go blank occasionally. So I guess it's my work with the Anthropocene Working Group that has brought me here. because Huckabee were very it was amazing. They decided to collaborate with us to as part of this long-term Anthropocene curriculum and this sort of collaborative investigation of this, this newly or proposed newly defined epoch. And so they brought us scientists in, and so it's amazing to actually, and as we were just talking before we started, that we're coming to the end of this collaboration, and it's been an absolutely unique collaboration to actually have scientists and artists and literary scholars to actually really truly collaborate and investigate this new paradigm, this new thing we have created as humanity and altered the planet. So it's very interesting to be here, because this is exactly the sort of environment which, as a geologist, I don't think as a geologist you never have training or really rarely do these sort of discussions to talk about, outside of your discipline, which has been a real treat to do this as part of this collaborative effort. So it'll be, let's see where we go. I don't know. So my adaptability ideas are very much based on I'm certainly not a specialist in adaptation or habitability, but it's these sort of long-term geological things in my head when I think about habitability. So I'm thinking about ecosystems and maybe species development and landscapes, and how these sort of habitats and they adapt. So maybe on longer term timescales than the human timescale. So the worry of Fernando of us being replaced by other organisms on this planet is part and parcel of being on planet Earth. It's a very human condition, I think, right now, to be worried about it, because we're the only organisms so far who have ever worried about it.
So there are two things that came up to me as you were talking, as you both were talking, that I think are especially interesting, although maybe very hard questions, but you can answer as much as you want. Because Patricia brought up the idea of a new historical epoch. And Simon, of course, has been working on the Anthropocene as a geological epoch. But then we have this odd situation with the conditions of the Anthropocene, where the geological and the historical fuse to a certain point, although for sure not completely, since they are established from different disciplinary points of view. So one part of my question is, what do you feel is the importance of the acknowledgement of this geohistorical shift, right? Because we could, on the one hand, we could go on without saying that there is such a thing as the Anthropocene, at least for a little while, since it's kind of hard to pinpoint it right now, even from a geological standpoint. So should we wait a little more? But of course, there's a political and historical importance also to doing this work. Even so, even more so than all of the geological work attached there, or the Earth system science work that has to be done. So that is one part of my question, the importance of this geohistorical shift, and maybe a small note to that, about this fusion of the geological and the historical. Since you're coming from different disciplines, what does that look like? Because as Patricia, I work a lot with these notions of an extended modernity that has certain conceptions of space, time, subjectivity, and reorganize the way we inhabit the planet. So I imagine a little bit, as Patricia, I'm thinking about how this new historical epoch that is coming up, that doesn't necessarily coincide with the Anthropocene, will be able to become something else regarding space, as Patricia mentioned, but also time and subjectivity, creating these new configurations of modes of habitability. But then how do we map that into what is a geological transformation, and what are historical transformations that preceded and come after it, and that do not necessarily coincide, right? When Jan was here in our cosmic conversation last time, Jan Zalasiewicz, he said, yeah, we're going for a certain date, mid 20th century, even if we feel that historically there are a lot of precedents that are relevant, right? But geologically, we can only do so much. We can only do this because we depend on what's written in rock, right? What's sediment. But of course, historically, we do a different kind of work when we're talking about this, because we can say, okay, but this happened before, and then there was this other event, these forces coalesced around that other thing. So I'm really interested in hearing you both talking about this.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like what you're suggesting, the way you're sort of describing the historical thing is, I think, what like somebody like Deepesh Chakrabarty does very well, right? Where it's like you have the death of the discipline of history, capital H, and so it's kind of like, in a way, like in a weird way, like Fukuyama was right, but it's totally not for the right reasons. And but it was just sick because, you know, when he's making those proclamations of the time, um, it's obviously like signaling a purely human end of a Cold War era, right? But when Chakrabarty is talking about it, he's naming, you know, the end of understanding history as a domain of purely human affairs. That it's just that the discipline of history is like us telling and having fights over what is the accurate version of like a sequence of human events. So I think that seems to be kind of in line. And to me, this always sort of conjures up this idea of, you know, like we need to have this ability to have a stereoscopy, you know, to borrow from some Salarzian imagery of different scales and simultaneity. And that, of course, is like one big trace of that is the naming of the anthropos of the Anthropocene as such, which has been widely criticized, and a lot of people give it a new term, Capitalocene, Plantationocene, etc. And in order to acknowledge the fact that you can't, we'd be ignoring a sort of more granular level of human history by substituting, like by implicating all of humanity in that, even though of course like the term itself is not incorrect, but it's happening at a certain scale, and you want to ask yourself like, well, how did we come to even define, or how did we arrive at this idea of humanity, right? And if you start to unpack that like you would through, say, the work of Sylvia Wynter, you realize like that is what has come to actually signify humanity is a very small subset of the species. And so curiously, she's also asking us to, when we consider history, to think about it both on the like regional but species level. So I'm always curious about these thinkers who weren't really in dialogue with each other, who are kind of all forcing us to be able to switch scales. Like, so how do we become these like ability to sense and operate in this kind of transscalar way? And to me, that's a really radical, that's going to force a really radical self-understanding, a different self-understanding of what we are, what we do, what we ought to do, where we're located. And these are huge, you know, cosmological shifts in our self-image, essentially. So I think like what that does is it starts to, even though these ideas sound really abstract and you're like, well, okay, but there's like literal fires and there's like floods, how does this help us? I mean, obviously this is not some techno fix, you know, or immediate thing, but these are all things that are shifting our relationship to reality, and therefore shifting our relationship to each other entities in the world, and to start asking yourself like, well, if this is the case, then how do you start to justify decisions, right? How do you start to understand purposefulness in a different way? How does that change your relationship to accountability, etc.? Like all these sort of cascading consequences arrive when you shift a position. So I think, although I know that's deeply unsatisfying for these like, you know, immediate concerns, but I think there is something that we have to also think about in this like really radical cosmological shift that is, I think, going to be necessary in order to, like one thing I'm really concerned about is like at this point equitable risk distribution. This is not going to be able, this is not possible within our current mode of operating. So if we keep going now, and if it's not a historical epochal shift, in the way we currently organize ourselves, the inequity of death here is going to be unfathomable. Like I can't even, it's just going to be terrible. And at the moment, it doesn't look like we're in a great shape politically to, we're not in a really hospitable political moment either. So I think, I don't know if that was a bit rambly, but.
What I thank you, Patricia. What I was just really interested when Fernando was just saying, like, and you mentioned about the like the death of history with a capital H, and I just think just some of the things, like, not the criticism, well, I suppose it is criticism, but like this seemed quite a straightforward geological question when I first came upon this, and so I've been working in environments where the geological evidence of, say, the late 20th century or certainly the 20th century in sediment sequences has always been there. It's because you can measure the radionuclides, you can measure the sediment accumulation rates, you can see materials like plastics, ceramics, rubbish, you can map it, you can see the impact of urban draining, just all these things are very apparent. So for me, it's the reality of this change has always been apparent. And it's interesting, and I was just thinking when Fernando says said about like history, and we didn't even talk about archaeology then. And I was just thinking, like, as archaeologists, it's bad. I can imagine, if you're in a history department and geologists are wading in saying, "Oh yeah, it's you've got to redefine history because of what we're saying." I mean, of course they're going to be upset. I mean, like, what? I mean, and similarly with archaeology, so there's this idea of, it's not the first time, and we're certainly not trying to identify like when human activity started to influence the planet. This isn't the Anthropocene epoch that we're working on, but we were set up to look at and investigate, has become focused on the mid 20th century, because rather than sort of thinking about it historically, we looked at it sort of, well, when the transformative processes are reflected in the geological record. And so you sort of, and it's that sort of thing that I think a lot of geologists don't mind getting involved, but you'd rather not be involved with human activity because it's quite nice to escape that. And so you can just look at old fossils and live and try and work out how a planet operates without humanity. And so to have to be also considering that is quite a challenge for the discipline, because it means you genuinely have to interact with archaeology and you have to think about history. And that isn't very normal in the current state of intellectual disciplines. It's very rare that geological processes to a huge detail are understood by historical. And similarly for me, if I'm sitting in a historical, it's just not taught. So you don't have these tools and language to understand and to really understand what impact this is going to have on other disciplines. So I think but the Anthropocene Working Group, we have always acknowledged our position. It's never been stated that we're trying to redefine history or redefine the archaeological record. It's just using the tools we have and the rules we have to establish these planetary changing time periods. And I think that's And so that's how it's come about. It's seeing this evidence of this significant change being obvious enough and massive. It's the scale of it and massive enough to say that it is genuinely different to anything archaeologically, let alone historically. And so we can't help but tread on toes and sort of and interweave with these disciplines. And it's, I think it's a way forward. It's certainly the way forward to be thinking about the planet. Geologists don't own the planet. Historians don't own history. I think, like who is to say which discipline can try and understand the past and also the future? And we need to sort of embrace these different perspectives and different scales to move forward, or else we'll just continue the Holocene. We'll continue these practices of trying to understand the planet until we decide to change it. So
yeah, I think I think you're raising a really important aspect of all of this, which is like also, how does this different geological era force us to reorganize knowledge practices? Because they are, as you said, they're all insufficient on their own. They all are necessary, but insufficient on their own. And so how do we, obviously there's been lots of stuff talked about in disciplinary siloization, or if that's even a word, I'm not sure. You know what I mean? Because, and again, I think there's like points to the magnitude of stuff. Like, I know I keep thinking about it, like, what, it's like maybe dramatic language, too dramatic for a scientist, but let's say, like, what does it mean to teach at the end of a world? And by world, I don't mean the end of, like, I don't mean doomsday. I just mean like the way that we've been organizing and doing everything, what seems like common sense, etc., is like kind of crumbling. So what does it mean to be engaged in pedagogy at this point with a kind of upcoming generation? And obviously our institutions are still organized very much in the Holocene in the Holocene schema. So it's an open question I have, but definitely I just wanted to highlight that I think it also does force us to confront the need to reorganize how we come to learn about things.
Yeah, and I think one of the funny things that come up immediately as you were having this conversation is that even if we try to really make an effort to restrict the Anthropocene to the geological, that is something that I often say to students. Okay, at the end of the day, we're talking about this rock is different from this rock. That's what we're trying to say when we're talking about the Anthropocene, and everything else is things that we are adding to it, which is great. But then, of course, when we are talking about it, it's very automatic that we go, well, this was back in the Holocene. This is a Holocene organization. This is a Holocene mindset, way of inhabiting. It's very, we are very quick to make this differentiation because obviously it would be, it seems at least, that it would be crazy to say that the Earth is in a new epoch and then to say, okay, but humans, we are still, I don't know, in post-modernity. Historically, we haven't changed. It's just the whole Earth that is in a new epoch right now. But us, we aren't that concerned with that. So of course that that brings us to automatically to this idea. Okay, there must be a historical shift, or there must have been a historical shift that brought us to this situation where we were put in this position that we think, okay, everything is different now. And then we have to rethink, and we can refer to the ways that we have been doing things as the Holocene way of doing things, even while we wish we could go back to the Holocene conditions of the planet. So I think this is very key for us to really think about how does geology, earth system science, atmosphere chemistry, and all of that, how does that fit into our historical work, philosophical work, but also, of course, the other way around. I was very I don't know if this is a side note, but I was very surprised by the latest paper by the Anthropocene Working Group, which was a philosophy paper. I mean, the idea of epoch, the idea of an event, the idea of an episode, right? It was a philosophical paper about how we understand time and periods and how does that organize. What is the scale of an event where it can be understood as being significant or not? To me, it really talks to what Bruno Latour talked about in a few papers of his and a few talks, which was this idea of a disciplinary shift bringing us towards what he would call a terrestrial science. This idea of the compartmentalization of the disciplines being unable to grasp what we're going through, and not, I think we can put that as an accusation, but I think it's much more interesting to think about it as something interesting that is happening despite whatever we feel about it, which is the fact that once you start thinking about it, you are already messing up with these borders between different disciplines.
Yeah,
so I guess please, Simon.
No, I just think because I like if that sort of disciplinary difference that, you know, everyone is fine about breaking down the Permian or the Triassic into quite defined time periods, and they are set at boundaries. They are, you know, certain millions plus or minus 100,000 or tens of thousands of years. So, you know, so that's how geologists work. You can have a you know, there are lines drawn, and we all know that, you know, like, you know, lines drawn on maps to define this is different to that, that is different to this. So we all know that those lines are representations. They're not, you know, and so stratigraphic lines, you know, they do describe sometimes very specific, but they also describe something to describe it, to understand it. And so that's why you have these sort of, you know, we're happy to describe geological time with these quite defined boundaries and nice, neat drawn lines. And then, but when you come nearer to like the historical or sort of, you know, the modern period, so we have the last ones in the Holocene, there's not many humans around, and the megalion at 4,200. There's a couple of places where that really does, you know, you can draw a line. One of the papers that was it Martin Head was the chief author, you know, you can draw a line through an archaeological structure. So you can say this bit of a staircase was the other bit of the Holocene, and then above it was a Megalion. And so you start going, well, hang on a minute, you're drawing a line for a staircase for a human structure, which you could then say that if you were born in that bit, you were in a Megalion, but if you were born in the other bit, you were not in a Megalion. And you go, well, that's not really how, you know, you don't, that's not how the human experience of time, you know, you don't wake up and go, oh, it's for Jurassic. You know, no one, you know, it didn't occur, you know, these things are all describing transformational processes. And so we're just getting to a point now with this Anthropocene epoch, but we're sort of using these techniques to draw lines and to define time. And I think, you know, it's not going to be anything soon, you know, we're not going to try and subdivide the last 70 years. This is probably the limit of geological line drawing you can do. And even then we're on very shaky ground because, you know, does this actually reflect reality? Are there actually rocks? Are there material? You know, of course, I mean, there are. That's why we're saying you can do it. But there is this sort of interesting process that we're just moving towards this time when our own disciplinary tools are clearly not effective enough, and we're going to have to start using other people's concepts, and similarly that, you know, we're going to have to be sharing this information, because on a sort of on a planetary scale you can start thinking about this, but obviously it's always going to be, you know, when you said about the acknowledgement, you know, clearly these changes are not as a result of everyone. This is a result of a very significantly powerful group of people, and you know, but as a collective now, it is, you know, and so it's hard to sort of how to sort of to draw these lines. And this is where, you know, I mean, it's a challenge, but I think it's a good challenge to have because it does make us think of us as a unity, rather than trying to always think about this sort of Holocene conditions that it's very, it's everyone's just doing stuff. But now we are big enough now to have this planetary scale transformation. Interesting. It's interesting, isn't it?
When you kept saying about all these lines, like I remember, I think I tweeted this like months ago, and I'm trying to remember the reference for it, but the idea was beautiful in the sense it was like cartography being understood as like lines that or the representational abstraction of the line in cartography becomes real. It manifests as a volumetrically, because we take those representations seriously. And it's not a challenge against representation. I think we need them for our cognition. But it's just to say of like that transformation, especially within the field of cartography, is like so. Think of how seriously we take national borders, and these are often arbitrary lines that have big fucking shadows, as in manifesting in reality, so to speak. And it's and that, in a way, I've always thought it's kind of, when you were talking about this is a good opportunity to really reflect on ourselves as a species, or Marx. People more familiar with Marx would maybe say like species being or something, that we have the self-consciousness to cognize ourselves at that scale. And one of the things that does give me hope, perversely, because I'm definitely not pro-nationalism, but think of how powerful that abstraction has operated for humans, right? Like in utterly, in sometimes terrible manifestations. But the fact that you go around the world and one of the first things you identify with is some 300 million people you've never met, and you say, I'm this, I'm that, I'm this, right? And so if that abstraction has had such a pull on our self-cognition for not that long a time, right? This is a relatively modern way of creating a taxonomy for people. Then if we're able to deal with that scale of of abstraction and self-identification, like, well, why not the species? Like, what would it take, right? But I think until it gets to the point where we're also willing to share in the risks and distribute the risks that that face the species at a non-uniform way, I feel like that concept is a bit feeble or flimsy, because this is like, oh, we're humanity until I need to make sure my comrades from the coastal Bangladesh have shelter, have food, have a safe place to live. You know what I mean?
But then before shifting more to our specific topic, there was something else that came up as you were talking, which has to do with the event that we were a part of in Berlin in October. Would you say that with this epoch shift that we are trying to map out here across disciplines, have we found the planetary? Of course, that I put the alien planet in the title of our conversation for us also to think about the planet, and if the scale we're looking for is really the planetary. I was thinking about that as we were thinking through that question, where is the planetary? Which is, of course, we have lived the age of the globe with colonialism and capitalism, but is what we're looking for the planet? Is it the world, different worlds, the Earth? And it seems like when we are talking about this shift, this geological and historical shift to a different epoch of the Anthropocene, we have, in a way, found an instance of planetarity. We have engaged in conversation with the planet, so to speak. as we try to become these readers of rocks once more, right? But I wanted to bring that question that we were working on in Berlin back to you. Do you feel like, is this what it means to find the planetary, to communicate with it in such a way where a geological shift is also a geohistorical shift, a historical shift? Or is there, finding the planetary would mean still looking for something else or creating different practices? What does it mean here to be in contact with the planetary or with planetarity?
Well, like I'm just
an easy question.
Yeah, no. So one of the things I think, so this project, this Golden Spike project, it has been for me the most evidence of planetary, of the planetary I think I've experienced. So just as a working practice, just as a sort of like my day-to-day life was, before doing this project, I was very much involved in sort of, I would say, national scale projects and individual sites and working, not massive things. So I've had to be thinking about the planetary. And so for me, I feel like I've moved into the planetary thought a lot more. So that's, just for me, and just thinking about Anthropocene and, having these discussions and seeing the limits of, so I think, so yes, but also, so not just like working on a project that requires using this unbelievable tool that we're doing right now. So up until the last couple of years, I was not doing this. I don't, we were having a few video calls and we'd all be amazed, but we've become this planetary communicative, I mean, not in a massive scale, but this is one evidence that we have. Here is the planetary. And then also in the last couple of years, COVID. I mean, I don't know if we probably can't think of a better example to show that we are all one planet. But within a very short space of time, that one virus and its variants spread around. And it wasn't like in the medieval time that we suddenly went, oh my God, what's this? We knew it was coming. So we knew we're capable of planetary thought and understanding. And when it's required, I think we can understand it. And then just on the last thing, I was just thinking about the last couple of days when that the Artemis mission went round the moon, and there was some footage like last week, and they was going, oh my God, look, you can see the moon and you can see the Earth. Oh, that's all there is. And then you compare that with what occurred on like Apollo 8 in 1960, I don't know, 8. Literally in 1968, it blew people's heads. They could not. They were like, oh my God, is that only our planet? Whereas now, look at that, you can see the moon. It was so much more like, it's a planetary. So I think our concept of a planetary is understood now more, because you can send a spaceship, and no matter how crackers that is, you can send a photo. You can take a photo of the moon and the Earth, and everyone goes, that's all right, isn't it? No one found that surprising. But that is us. That is our planet, and that is all we have. Everyone just, I think that is embedded in people. I think it's still not enough to make us decide to do something better, or to manage that little blue thing in space better. But it's just interesting. It's quite a contrast. Barely made the news. All right, look at that, planet Earth from space. Quite astonishing. That's not really an answer, but it's just the things that came into my head. But
yeah, I agree with you to a degree. But this is where I think I really make the distinction between, and this is partly why the catalyst, like coming to this recognition, was also part of the catalyst of being interested in the relationship between models and how they affect the space of reasoning, your practices as a result, is precisely because we have this immense capacity for recognition. Like there's a consensus within the scientific community, more or less, right? we've all seen these images of the one blue marble planet Earth, kumbaya, etc. So I think the problem is not, and I think even politically, I think it's less a problem of climate denialism, this outright thing, right? I think that's becoming a little bit more fringe, and rather you're seeing a more eco-fascist response to, which was I would say the former climate deniers are now the rising sort of eco-fascist. But what to me this means that, like, it's a difference between knowing about that and then trying to think about the consequences. Like, if we recognize that, if we say that is true and we recognize it as true, how ought this to be ramified in a transformation of our practice? That's really what I'm interested in exploring. There's no clear answer, right? There could be some very terrifying consequences of that. So really interested in, like, how do we model those ramifications? How do we build, simulations? How do we think about the ethics of these translations? And to me, that's like where the Spivak's planetarity kind of, for me, is a bit of a distinction between the planetary and planetarity, because to me, the planetarity would be precisely that space of concrete modes of doing, because of how that knowledge, that abstract knowledge, like, infuses the way you approach the world. So that's why, I don't know, I always think, so when you say, like, have we found the planetary, I don't think for me, it's not a matter, or have we found planetarity? I would say, like, we have to make it. That's the call, because it's about how we're going to imagine reorganizing ourselves in view of these crises, in view of some risks that now seem irreversible. But that doesn't mean that it's just a, fuck it and let's see, kind of moment. It's like, we can do a lot. But I think that's where the political dimension comes in, because it's like, how are we going to let this drive our space of reasoning different modes of engagement? And I think COVID, like, it's such a great example of understanding how interconnected we are and how that brings certain vulnerabilities. But it also pointed out the terrible tools we have to govern this. It was just like, we have still so much of the African continent not vaccinated because of patent laws, pharmaceutical companies making record profits for incredible, innovative, quick work, right? That is like some incredible, heroic work, that we could have a vaccine so quickly, yet then caught within ridiculously ineffective patent blah blah blah, so it can't be distributed equally. Like, all of that stuff was captured, and then it was so frustrating in a way to watch. Like, I think the thing with the planetary and governance is you definitely don't want to jump to this conclusion, oh, we need a overseeing singular planetary government. That's terrifying. But nonetheless, you would see, like, the kind of symbolic only consequences of the WHO, right? Where, like, that Tedros, I can never say his last name, but the chef of the WHO, just like, as soon as the vaccines became available, they knew exactly how this was gonna play out, and their function was only they could only at best be morally reprimanding to the wealthy nations who were hoarding the vaccines to get back to business. And that was a real incredible evidence, yes, of our interconnectedness, but the poorness of our institutional setup to really be of service, even though, despite having the quick technology to do that. I mean, that was unthinkable to, to get a vaccine that quickly. So that's where there seems to be this, like, big discrepancy all the time between what we know we could do, how this stuff could be put to work, and just the terrible ways we're organizing ourselves and, like, into spaces where we cannot flourish, And then you start getting into discussion about survival, resilience, adaptability. It's like, no, let's try to talk about flourishing. Like, what could we do that we could actually enjoy this space together?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, that's so. I'm glad we both. Yeah, but I thought about COVID. I think the COVID thing was, it's in people's mind, at the front of people's minds. that sort of planetary scale for these things do occur. And it's interesting, like in climate change is still, it takes, it is recognized that it is a global thing. Like the atmosphere does not stop at national borders. Pollution does not stop at national borders. And I guess that's one of the things which this sort of the epoch we're trying to define. We're using these things that really for the first time in the planetary, not, like we're using plutonium because it's truly a global signal. Now it was created by a small group of people, quite a large group of people, but still not a massive amount of people, but it was spread globally as a result of activity. And so you have this situation where you have this global imprint and this this understanding people started to understand that, like, what a way to find out that the planet is actually one thing than to start detonating massive bombs and find it. I had no idea the hemispheres were connected. And so there is that. So that's quite a nice example of this sort of realization that transboundary pollution, it doesn't stop. Chinese pollution doesn't stop at Chinese borders, and Indian pollution doesn't stop at the Himalayas. It all mixes up. It's very hard to, you have to think about these bigger lines drawn on maps, spatially as well as temporally. There you go. So it is a crazy thing to start trying, but it's a very scientific thing to start trying to compartmentalize and to differentiate. That's so the geological timescale, what, 19th century? There's a few drawings by Renaissance people to start breaking down these things into understandable chunks. It's very normal. I think it's normal scientific. It's also very normal human behavior, I think, to try and differentiate, and to sort of draw some boundaries. I think boundaries are fairly prevalent in the natural world, at least territories. There's always so far you can go and find food, or so, these things, but the line drawing is such a human thing. And I think, if the Anthropocene could do one thing, if we could start removing, if we didn't have to define the Anthropocene, that would be an interesting thing. If there wasn't a line to be drawn, if we actually did, because I was just thinking, one of the questions I find hardest to answer is if someone says, well, if we define the Anthropocene epoch, what will the politicians do? And I have literally, well, they're not suddenly going to go, oh my God, we've been doing it wrong ever since so it's not by on its own account, it's not going to change the world. It's not really designed to do that, but if it can do anything to reframe some of these questions, to describe the scale of this, that we have transformed it to a magnitude that is now the planetary, then I think that's what we can do.
So coming back to our so-called main topic,
so-called, it's just a catalyst.
because I think that we have worked through a lot of things that really brings us to this question of adaptation and inadaptation that we were talking about, because precisely of this contradiction, maybe, or this ironic position in a more Haraway sense, which is this sort of acknowledgement of planetarity to a certain extent, of course, in many different ways. But this idea, I think the example that Simon gave is very good in the sense of it's not surprising that it is one whole planet. It doesn't mean that people have a planetary conscience or whatever that would mean, but the planet in itself is not something that could surprise anyone. It is one whole thing, and the atmosphere is around it, and things travel through water. I mean, that is not surprising anymore. This connectedness is more or less acknowledged. But of course, there are no obvious political consequences from it. there are no obvious conceptual consequences from it. All of that is work to be done for better or worse, right? But what does it mean then, as we were talking before, to try and think about what is a mode of inhabiting attuned to planetarity, and which can be a good or a bad thing. I'm not saying, we must be planetary and this is the solution to our problems. But what does it mean to try and look for these new ways of inhabiting that take planetarity into account? And then in the conversation that we had back in October, Simon offered up this word of adaptation as a condition of habitability, as a way of thinking through how is habitability produced, right, collectively by the organic, the non-organic. But it is, of course, as Patricia just mentioned, a complicated word, fraught with a harsh history. Even if we go back to the 19th century, the way this term was quickly picked up, what we call neo-Darwinism, or much worse, the social Darwinism, was very, very quick to appear from this idea of adaptation, or what we say now, resilience, and all of these terms that denote this certain idea of resisting or enduring change. It also became a political tool to say to people that they don't have the right to anything more than enduring, right? So how do we navigate? Here's the easy question: how do we navigate this collective construction of new ways of inhabiting, while also having to deal with this idea that we have to adapt to planetarity and find ways of, even in a certain sense, coping, mourning, to try and find our footing in this new situation, while also at the same time rejecting those that wouldn't allow us to flourish, as Patricia was saying, using this adaptation discourse to make it so that we get by with the bare minimum, right? Or that going to zero emissions of CO2 actually means that 90% of the world population will not be allowed any sort of comfort, because these are very real possibilities. At the same time, that would be planetary adaptation, a new way of inhabiting, right? So how do you feel that we go from this planetary acknowledgement to thinking up? I'm not saying how is this going to come about, which is a very hard question, and we can't answer it right now. But what are some hints of ways of inhabiting, and how does that adaptation play into that?
I like your easy question, Fernando. So just when I was refreshing my mind this morning about what I was talking, I think I'll just start with my adaptability and why I said that. And we'll go. So when I was suggesting that adaptability was really good for habitability, or at least useful, or at least key, I think, in hindsight, what I was thinking of is that geological perspective, that when you look at how fossils and life on Earth pre-Anthropocene, it looks incredibly well adapted to habitability. You can't, every ecosystem is absolutely full with ecological niches that organisms are adapted to, and whatever they do it right to the limits of their existence. So with, as a natural scientist, you look at it and you go, wow, adaptation is astonishing for habitability, and adaptation through Darwinian evolution has been extraordinary in enabling organisms to adapt. And what I think I maybe didn't. I mean, I was just reading what I wrote for that thing. I tried to get across it, like it's the what we struggle with is the time scale of adaptation. But on the geological time scale, evolutionary time scale, that unbelievable suitability of organisms for living in those environments, that adaptability just looks exquisite, but it hasn't happened overnight. Those changes have occurred over thousands of years. That is on a time scale that for humans, when we talk about adaptability, is just unbelievable. We can't really conceive that when we say, oh, you move to that new village after that civil war, you'll adapt. It's like a thing. Oh, you can just adapt. You're human. You can adapt, and we can adapt. We are amazingly adaptive organisms, but we're having to adapt on timescales that we and maybe intellectually, physically, physiochemically, we can't. We're unable to adapt. And it's going to take a while before the Holocene, Pleistocene humans are able to sort of fully adapt to sort of the Anthropocene. So I think that's one thing that was the thing I'd sort of like missed out sort of talking about in Germany, this sort of like the timescales that adaptability is a very useful word because it seems like that's how planet Earth works, that there's adaptation. But what we don't often think about is how long this stuff really takes. And it's far longer than a 4-year political cycle. And so this idea of like removing these sort of like traditional political boundaries, thought boundaries, is perhaps the way we do this, and we do have to adapt. So it's not just adapting, we need to adapt everything, I think, rather than just some things. That doesn't really go anywhere to answer your question. Although that was a really hard question, Fernando. You should think about shortening your questions. I'd hate to go on a date with you. It must be terrifying. Where do you live?
Yeah, these are, especially, I think it's kind of cruel because you're asking us like, it's like 14th of December. Everyone's like so burnt out after teaching and whatever, all like, but
we haven't even got on to like what we can do, but like to get to this. So I mean like how, sorry, Patricia, but I mean, maybe you say something and then we can we'll have a brainstorm about actually what we can do.
Yeah, I mean, because of course in that moment, like I kind of countered with this idea of non-adaptation, right? Just in the sense that obviously, like, it wasn't to be like this enfant terrible and be like you're wrong, because like I said, there's a dialectic between non-adaptation and adaptation. And the reason I bring it up is, I mean, one thinker that's been hugely influential for my thinking on these topics has been Sylvia Wynter, and a lot of her, and she has a very she kind of basically she works on the questions of like, what is the human, but the reason why that's so important is that it becomes a reference point for all modes of social organization, evaluation, how we organize our knowledge practices. All this it's kind of like, imagine like a solar system. So whatever idealized figuration of the human you have, and of course this is European man, etc. All the things are in adaptive relation to this thing, and so there's that version of the human. There's also the human that is, partly biological, partly metabiological, right? The things we craft environments that then craft us back, right? So there's that metabiological dimension of humanness that allows us the capacity through politics or whatever, could be other things, that allows us the possibility to not adapt because we can precisely shift our referential figures, shift our references in grounding our reasons for doing things. And certainly one thing we do have a choice about is, maybe we don't have a choice about, it's not like adaptation is a kind of intentional thing, right? It's definitely not that, but we do have a choice over what kind of technofossils we're going to leave behind. These are deliberate choices that will leave traces, and they leave traces at a biological level, right? Like we have our brains are reconfigured because of our interactions with tools, technologies, environments, etc. So like that's what I mean about the non-adaptation thing. It was also a way to like I said, kind of overcome some of these, I think, quite like brutally stated, and in a way like they're trying to celebrate the heroism of humans in terrible conditions to somehow survive, like our, the famines in where I'm kind of losing my geography here, but like people that, like, the human spirit that triumphs in against all odds and so on. And this strikes me as incredibly cruel in a way. And in fact, a lot of the language that is applied to describe this condition of humans to do this, and they do it, is from like material science, right? So yes, I want resiliency in a bridge construction. I think that's a wonderful concept. I definitely want that in that kind of application. But like when we use that metaphor from like material science and apply to the human, when we know alter the conditions of inhabitability, then isn't that kind of cruel to like then celebrate, oh, but you're so resilient? It's like, well, why don't we get food there? Or why don't we, this is what's, that's why I also wanted to bring in that dynamic of non-adaptation, which I said it's not against adaptation, but it's in a kind of dialogue, or it's a dialectical relationship. But that was the reason for also bringing that metabiological kind of trajectory, if you will.
Yeah, and the other thing I just thinking about the non-human there is like, I mean, we are unique, but we're thinking about how we can conceive what would be a good idea to adapt, and like you say, it's quite the resilience for, say, the language, the resilience of some other species compared to not just humans, but like, there's like cockroaches. Oh, they're great, they're very resilient species. And like, well, that's that's not necessarily a good thing. You have these resilient species because they're the ones which are just able to. That's not a great thing, if you just end up with resilient species.
I don't know what the quality of life of a cockroach is like from the and I don't mean that as a joke. I mean, like, from their perspective, is there even something like the quality of life of a cockroach? Do they? I mean, I guess this is an unknowable, like, do they care about such a thing? Because we certainly care about our quality of life. Like, I don't think there's any human on the earth that is only hoping for enough calories, tasteless calories, to survive I don't think there's any human that is seeking that as a goal. Like, we care about how we we care about, like, more than just continuing the species. Like, we care about how the quality of that existence. Like, we care about existential questions.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to think about. What does human persistence mean in the Anthropocene? I think your point about resilience is very it's actually very to the point, in the sense that we are always talking about resilience, in the sense that what is how much can it take before it breaks, right? So why would we evaluate people on those terms, right? So, oh wow, amazing, this person was brought to their breaking point, but it didn't break. So why must we bring people to their breaking point every day, right? But of course, that's already a huge ethical ask on whatever adaptation will mean in the Anthropocene. Not a huge ask because it's non-intuitive. Of course, that anyone would say, oh, we want everyone to be happy and all of that. But of course, what we are doing right now is putting people in these conditions where they have to be resilient, or whatever that means. But the danger, of course, here of what we are talking about is that could mean adapting could mean that, right? It could mean that, okay, we're all going to be resilient in the face of climate change, and 10% of the population will do a bit more than that. So, and these are the possible pitfalls of just this idea of how do we craft this adaptation? So it's interesting to think about when we were talking about more than just inhabitation, but different modes of inhabiting. What are collective modes of inhabiting that we could craft where we could be talking about adaptation, but adapting to something better, right? Adapting to something that would not bring us to this condition of having to be resilient in the face of enormous odds, but actually, as Patricia said, flourishing. And I love this word; it's a very Haraway word. To think about what does it mean to live a life worth living, right? And that's a very tough question because, of course, we have different answers for it. But creating the collective conditions for that is a very, very necessary work. And throughout what we were talking, you all gave some hints to what you were thinking about there. But maybe we could go over a few topics that you find are important for this sort of maybe survival guide in an alien planet, right? So what would be some of those ideas that you mentioned? Most of all, throughout our talk, you mentioned this effacing or changing of lines, especially in national borders, because planetary forces us to think about borders in a very different way. But what are other epochal shifts that you think are relevant to inhabiting an alien planet?
Can I just ask you what you mean by that? Like, because when I hear you say alien planet, do you mean like a planet that is no longer crafted in our image or understood as craftable in our image? So therefore it's the becoming alien in the way that it's like not just there for us?
Not necessarily for us, because I think that's a very there is a certain ecological imagination and a critique to ecology that has to do with how self-centered it is to think about the proper environment when there are so many other species and so on. But the fact is that the Holocene is home, or the Holocene, but also in a larger sense, the last few hundreds of thousands of years that have produced a certain kind of adaptation where that's what it means to be Earth, or that's what it means to be home to a lot of species, right? Mm-hmm. So the weird thing that happens, and that's why I'm insisting on this alien world expression, is that this place is no longer fully home, mm-hmm. right? Because mm-hmm. in this sense, because of our actions. If there are, this is something that I always try and wrap my head around when we think about Earth system science or Gaia theory, or this idea that every species on Earth, and actually also the non-living, is always terraforming Earth, right? Making Earth more earthy. But the thing that we did in our collective creation of the Anthropocene is making Earth unearthly, right? And that's why I mentioned this idea of an alien planet. So learning, of course, it's not as harsh as learning how to live on Mars, although some people insist on that. But still, it brings us to think, we have to think about more things than just how do we want to live together, and that the environment is a given in a certain sense, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, thanks for clarifying.
So the first thing that comes to my mind is the critical thing of migration. I think that's probably going to be a massive thing in terms of collective adaptation, which we don't have the tools right now to deal with properly. And that it sort of brings us back to that discussion of borders, to really deal with climate change and social changes, or whatever, whatever changes have occurred and created these situations in like the Horn of Africa, or wherever it becomes that existence of a friendly planet to a planet that is you're unable, whether that's through civil, like alien planets are created, in many ways, what you can turn down a road sometimes and experience an alien planet, or you can go to the bottom of a lake and it's completely, so these are all perceptions of outside of what you would expect. And I think in terms of things like climate change and things like, and you mentioned like in with flooding like Bangladesh, and so there are these situations now occurring where the modes of collective adaptation are really just, people have got to move, and species have got to move, and how we adapt to these changes. You can't just say, well, this is now a wildlife reserve, this is where the elephants migrate to, and we'll put a fence around it, because that is now insufficient. That the rains are not moving as they used to be, or the seasonal flooding is now more restricted. So so there's always all these changes are occurring that humans and other species are having to adapt to, and by drawing lines and saying, we think we can understand this by compartmentalizing, or sort of, is insufficient. We need to be much more flexible in how we think about these adaptations. We can't just draw another line and say, oh, well, everyone from Bangladesh can just go and live in that bit of India, or because we know that these sort of like migrations of people, forced or defined, or sort of, just drawing a line on a map, well, it's okay, you can go and live there. It will be a bit, because it's completely alien, but people who have just moved from there will find it's still the same planet, but it is completely alien to what they experienced before. My dog has just found aliens, I think.
Yeah, I think I'm really interested in the kind of and I don't have answers about like different theories of governance, which is obviously tied to the migration thing. And I think partly this is like maybe the guilty conscience of a Canadian speaking, especially to a Brazilian, right? Like we're just like probably maybe one of the few countries that actually understands the truth of our evilness. You know what I mean? From all of our mining activity, because everyone else is like, oh, you're all smiley and nice, and I'm like, no, we're terrible, evil people who don't care about the planet. But in seriousness, like I think the case of Canada is quite interesting, in the sense of, obviously one of the very few nations that could strike it absolutely rich in for the more catastrophe. In some ways, it is suffering its own environmental catastrophes. I think the last thing I read was like 10% of homes now are uninsurable because it's the largest coastal region. Nonetheless, new opportunities arise in the north with the melting, which was also land that was, or it's indigenously governed territory. So how that conflict will pay out as soon as there's big money to be made in that region, which was once thought like, yeah, go up there and have fun and no one's going to care. It's obviously, we know the Arctic is turning into a big geopolitical kind of spot of contestation. But then the other thing too is just like, again, with these arbitrariness of lines and trying to imagine accountability, I think like the low population of Canada, I read, this was like a Guardian article several years ago, but I think quite powerful in the sense of illustrating what this concretely means. So there's like 0.5% of the world's population lives in Canada. Very small, right? Very insignificant. Obviously, huge resource base. And if we were to, as a nation, and of course, all of our governance structures are tied to the Canadians decide, could decide on what happens within their territorial boundaries. If the projected amount of resources would be extracted, obviously, which is attractive because you get a lot of money for this, it would use up something like between 50 or 60%, something in that nature, of the projected global Paris Accord climate budget. So the point being that 0.5% would have some degree of governance, some degree of decidability, very weak, but some degree of decidability over something that could impact the globe at like such a disproportionate scale. And obviously it's not only happening in Canada. I just cite that example because it's the one that is close to me. But nonetheless, you have all those kind of discrepancies happening. Exactly how when Simon described, oh, we're going to detonate this thing, let's, without any idea, and now they've produced a planetary phenomena. So something that happened in a very specific location, very small amount of people, has its consequences. And increasingly, I think we're facing up with we need to find ways to develop accountability for this, and it's really dangerous because of course the West would want to say, oh, Brazil, you should preserve all of your rainforest, and everyone wants to make money. And so there, it'd be like, we can exploit all of our stuff here, but you guys, you need to preserve 80% of your territory because it's the lungs of the world or something, right? So it's not such a clear-cut answer is what I'm saying, but I think our structures of governance are very ill equipped to deal with that. And like I said, I don't have some kind of sufficient answer beyond, you could imagine within our current legal structure there'd be some kind of punishment, like it's a crime against humanity or something if you do it. But that also seems like applying a very particular legal humanistic regime and applying it to something, like it feels kind of like a mismatch, So those are questions I'm really interested in thinking through and looking at different models of how what that could mean, and yeah, definitely from the perspective of my passport country.
Yeah, collectively, please, Simon.
No, I just I think you're absolutely right about the like the accountability, because we can talk about like, well, how come it's still allowed that you can strip Borneo, say, for palm plantations, and destroy ecosystems, which like all these and people say, well, maybe we should if give orangutans some sort of rights to exist, and that of course that, but those structures of law, there are no the laws to protect ecosystems are so insufficient, because there is this sort of Holocene expectation that there's always more land or more ecosystems or recovery will occur, and it will be it'll be fine. We're just able to utilize this and extract it. And as we're finding, it used to be the forests used to go as far as the hills, and it turns out there aren't any more over the other side of the hill. That's it. We don't have this continual, even the Amazon is a finite space. And so we're able to appreciate that, which is, I guess it brings us back to that sort of like, we are able to conceive this planetary, it's not just the Amazon, it's the Congo Basin. People are joining these things up, and that's it. It's good to be able to see this, but we just don't, I don't think we don't have the strength sufficient law, or even just, like every time someone says, oh, we should ask Brazil to stop burning their rainforest, really, what can you do as a country? What can you implement, in terms of trade, or it is incredibly difficult currently. And then I just thought, and it just came into my mind, I just thought this week's news about fusion, no problem, we'll just have unlimited energy. And it's just a bit of an aside, but I just suddenly thought it just sounded like one of those things where someone went, hey, we've just invented atomic power, now we can really plow up a rainforest. We'll just get some atomic powered bulldozers, now we can really start transforming. And you just go, oh no, I didn't hear anyone say about this is going to be great, we're going to have a more sustainable planet. It was unlimited energy. You go, oh no. Yeah, it's a tricky one.
Yeah, one of the things that really come up and has been coming up with students and all of these different talks is really this contradiction or this sense of disorientation, and especially something that Patricia mentioned a few times, this mismatch of scales, right? This mismatch of needs and mismatch of expectations, in the sense of feeling that knowing and feeling that something is happening, being unable to act, and all of these contradictions that force themselves upon us right now, and in a sense are making a lot of people actually sick with it, right? With worry and anxiety and suffering over this sort of disorientation and mismatching of the possibilities of action, and in the inability of governance to act towards what seems like would be necessary, at the same time, while we are not sure what is necessary to do in what way, right? We know, okay, reduce the emissions here, preserve that in this sort of general sense. But as you both were talking, the tools aren't properly fit for the tasks, right? It seems like we have a bunch of things to do that we more or less can see through, like through a mirror darkly. We see the things that must be done, but it seems like we can't get to them, right? It seems like every tool is trying to fit like a square through a circle, right, in a certain sense. And then there's some factor of adaptability here, of course, because how do we circle the square to fit it through and make it so that the tool fits the task? But as some closing arguments here for our conversation, bringing back to adaptability, if you could say a few words about this disorientation or this mismatch of needs, and how do you feel, and it can be for you personally or for you collectively as part of organizations, institutions, and groups. What do you feel are orienting ideas for you? Or some things that guide you, give you a plan, give you a map, a track. It doesn't have to be any great thing or an actual answer, but something that is, in a way or another, orienting for you.
I mean, not that, like, maybe to kind of close it out with like, because I mentioned at the beginning working on this kind of spatial issues, like asking the question, what is planetary space, and how does it how do we understand ourselves embedded within it in this kind of high dimensional space, so space of complexity that you can't necessarily you can't really localize yourself within 3 dimensions. Like, we're not basically in an analog like geometry, we're not in a Euclidean space anymore. And so, but more specifically on the orientation, I think what that suggests is that the planetary. I always try to think of the planetary in this high dimensional space, because I think that when we only look at it at one scale, then it's I don't think that's the helpful way to think about it. I think it's existing at many scales. So one part of orientation may be about developing like precision for scale specificity. So I mean, this is a kind of twist on something that was really common, or still is, in the art world, towards site specificity, or even probably in the sciences you have a site specificity. But to me, I think that site is always at a kind of humanist Euclidean scale, in a way, like where those thresholds, imaginary thresholds that define a site, what part of a site, what is part of the site and what is not part of the site, are drawn at a certain scale. And that scale specificity needs to become transparent for us, so that we know, and we can also target, when you said the tools we have are like not fitting, I think that's where we can get into like how can we understand the tools we bring to how we organize ourselves in this condition. How can we conceive of them in scale specific ways? So like, for example, the square tool in the in the round hole is like, well, maybe at a certain scale that is a fitting one, and it's actually like a square peg for a square hole, and that's sufficient, and we can be happy with that, and or we get a heuristic out of that. But at different scales, we'll need to adapt, and we need to be, and that's for me where this kind of productive alienation happens, is like that you're not always bringing down all of this complexity to the scale of a human, which has been our tendency. This is like Zachary Horton has a expression called like panhumanist scale, you know what I mean? And I agree, it's the temptation to like morph everything to something amenable to our scale. And part of inhabiting, I understood it more like this kind of conceptual alien world condition you're talking about. Part of that to me is like, how do we navigate unfamiliar scales? And so I know unconcrete sort of expression, but I feel like that manner of framing the problem is what's giving me some hope in order to try to find a sense of positionality within it. And then, but in a very concrete way, you know, certain things, like I will just say, one of the things the pandemic forced me to do because I was bored was I just started like growing things and like chucking seeds in soil and doing this. And on a very personal scale, because I think when people say, oh, don't just talk about this in a personal problem of like, you shouldn't fly or you shouldn't consume this and that. I think our everyday life will change, you know, especially for people in the global north that are hugely responsible for this. And just doing this small activity of like literally on my balcony, I cannot waste any food anymore, simply because I know the energy it takes to grow one bloody tomato. You know what I mean? And so even doing that silly trivial activity that has zero impact, for my consciousness, it has an impact. I use every little thing. Is it going to change the world? Absolutely not. Is it some panacea? No, but it was some minor interaction that did change the way that you would go about things. I come from North America, where just this stuff just shows up in supermarkets. And so I think there is something about producing different interactions with stuff, and that proximity of a relation has some, even if it's minor consequences. It's not terrible to not waste food. You know?
Yeah, it's interesting. I like the idea of like at what scale is the best way to try and conceive this, and I think I can, you know, I totally understand. Like if you start thinking about the planetary, and then you start thinking, what am I going to do? I mean, like it's almost overwhelming, and again, and it is. You can see why it creates great anxiety, because it just seems unfeasible that one, you know, individuals, you know, no matter what you do, it somehow you're fighting against this sort of planetary scale, national scale things. And it's interesting, but you still have, you know, and it was interesting at the meeting in Huckabay that we had, that it was a great discussion following soup making I had, where we were talking, there was a guy from Syria about and he was saying about like this, you know, it's always down to like, oh, individuals need to do something, you know, like somehow, you know, like somehow it's like that sort of, oh, if individuals can't be bothered to do it, then the government won't get involved. And I was really interesting, because like he was saying, well, like, you know, at some point, you know, the bigger collective of governance has to take, you know, to do something, because as an individual level, we can't do everything. We can't change, you know, we can't do stuff. We need a governance structure to actually start changing. And I found that was a really, because in the West, you know, like you go, oh, I've really got to do the recycling, you know, and when you look into it, and recycling is it's not great, you know, things like plastic, you know, most of it, you know, but we think it's great, so we just do it and everyone buys into it. And so that collective feeling of doing something is something that you have to channel. We have to use that energy, because people really want to change stuff. But we also need the big governance structures to actually to utilize that. And there was just one thing about the right sort of scale, and it brings me back to a nice geography thing. But a really effective way of understanding how big enough processes operate is at a catchment scale. So you take a river. So you say, well, everyone in this catchment, they defecate, they eat, food comes in, food goes out, it rains, there's groundwater, there's temperature, so it's a conceivable scale to understand semi-planetary processes, but it's not overwhelming. And it means that people within communities can see themselves, their community, and other communities sort of operating, and there are measurements. You can measure how much dissolved oxygen is as a result of downstream or pollutants, and so I think that's sort of like trying to think about the best scale for what we want to achieve. And so a catchment, of course, like the Amazon is far too big a catchment. But like, that's not a bad way of thinking about these. There are definable geographical things, not necessarily drawn on with lines, but which do enable you to start thinking about how we can sort of live in these sort of spaces much more effectively, and also sort of like measurably. And if you start measuring things, then we can start utilizing it. But it is very hard to think planetary, which is why it's much easier to think on a much smaller scale. So we need to find a balance, and I think it's.
Yeah, I love.
I like the way you bring in this idea of. Sorry, just to say, like, I think what you're alluding to is like a really important dynamic of the planetary, which is the question of reduction and resolution. And I mean reduction in a positive sense, that we're going to need to reduce it in a good way, in a helpful way, in a heuristic way, like you have with the catchment settlement. So is it a vehicle, even if it's a, let's say, low res vehicle to understand the planetary, but nonetheless, that's great. Like, let's talk about those different resolutions, if it's going to enable ways to access the type of thinking that is required.
Yeah,
that wasn't a burglar. That was just my son coming in.
I love that you both turn to scales as in this matter of orientation here that we are looking for, because I feel that precisely that is one of the dangers of when we try and think planetarily, which is this our incapacity to feel the scale of the whole planet, and then feeling trapped in our very personal scale, right? Of being like, okay, we have to do something that is of planetary importance, otherwise it is irrelevant. And then we go back to, okay, but I can only do things as much as my personal capacity of doing is able to, right? And then we feel trapped in this sort of and actually this classical contradiction of social sciences, especially between the personal and then the global, etc. But it's very interesting to suggest that just that, okay, but we can shift scales, we can nest them, we can connect them in different ways, and then I'm not thinking about my personal scale, but I can think about a sort of a catchment scale, or a neighborhood scale, or different levels of collective existence that make up whatever we feel as the planetary, without necessarily me having the obligation to act at a planetary level, which is, of course, infeasible for any sort of human, unless, of course, I guess, someone that's pressing to launch a nuclear warhead, something like that. That person is doing a personal action of planetary scale. But other than that,
it's accidental, though, right? Because we're also talking about like intentionality.
Exactly.
I don't think they were like, we're gonna make something called Anthropocene. Boy.
Had a big A. It had a big A button.
Yeah. So I feel like that's a great idea and concept to orient ourselves, even if it's such a difficult topic to work with. But again, and this is something that I guess we can close with, it is scale is such an amazing concept to think about, also because it's not discipline specific. It invites us once again to cut through disciplines, and then if I have to think about the scale of a river, I go through so many different disciplines to try and think about what is around the river, below, above it, and so on. So I think it's so relevant to highlight that the tools that we're trying to work with to really inhabit this alien planet are all cross-discipline tools, and that is something that we should really highlight. But then it means that we have to work together, right? And in that sense, I thank you very much for being here, Patricia and Simon. I had a great time with our conversation.
Thanks
And
for having us. Next time, bring us over, especially in the winter. Bring us over to.
Yeah.
Although, yeah, we shouldn't be flying so much, but you're all like
well,
you're like sweating, and we're all like.
yeah, it's really hot in here. But really, I want to thank you so much for being here. This is a very inspiring conversation, and I hope we have the chance to continue it.
Yeah, well, thank you. Nice to see you, Patricia. Merry Christmas.
You too, Simon. Yeah, have a great holiday. Have a nice break. Thanks again, Fernando.
Cheers.
Talk
See you
to
at the
soon.
beach, Fernando.
See you soon. So, and I want to thank everyone that has been watching us or will watch us in the future. This has been Cosmic Conversations of our 2022 series. You can find all of it on our website, apph.com/cc, or you can check out the project page on the Anthropocene Curriculum website, where you can also find all of these conversations and also the conversations of the 2021 and 2020 series of Cosmic Conversations. We'll be having a few more conversations in the following 30 days, 40 days. So tune in and you'll be able to watch some more of these very heady, but I hope lighthearted conversations. Well, see you all soon.
Ciao.
Ciao.